What does this airplane, and this airplane all have in common? Let's find out on Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. What these three airplanes have in common, along with all of these, is that they are cutaway illustrations. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at cutaway art from the golden age of technical illustration in the 20th century. Cutaways come in many different forms. They can be very simple, showing callouts of specific structure, or they can show you the entire airplane in vivid detail. Before we get started, I thought I'd share some early inspirations that led me on a path to my own career as a cutaway artist. It all started with the books I had as a kid. They taught you everything you needed to know about jet planes. They even showed you what was inside a giant bomber. I couldn't wait to get involved in this. And so here in second grade, I'd learned how to spell, and this is my very first cutaway illustration of well, an airplane, but it's a start. By junior high, I was developing a better sense of aircraft structure. As a senior in high school, I discovered rapidograph pens and designed this little microjet showing the inside as well. That led to a career as a staff illustrator at McDonnell Douglas, where I did, cutaway illustrations. Well, it was an amazing 10 years, and I'd like to introduce you to one of the greatest aviation artists who ever lived. The gentleman on the right is the legendary Robert Grant Smith, better known as RG. I had the privilege of working with RG. He was a great friend, a mentor, a wonderful teacher, and just a really outstanding artist who did breathtakingly beautiful art like this, which hung in the lobbies of the Douglas buildings at Long Beach. And he was honorary naval aviator number 10 based on his beautiful artwork. But before this, he was a configuration engineer, and his first airplane was the SBD Dauntless. And here we see an engineering drawing done by RG. Look at the detail. You talk about knowing the airplane from the inside out. And by the way, that's all hand lettered, just magnificent. This is a pencil sketch that RG made of the A4 Skyhawk. And this sketch led to a final engineering drawing that was rendered by Mr. Bob Wallace of the presentations department at Douglas. But it was made possible by the engineering work of RG. Why is this important? Well, to be able to draw like this, you have to know the airplane from the inside. And this is a sketch that RG did of the A4M. And you can see the three-dimensional look of the airplane is achieved one pencil stroke at a time, defining the contour of the structure. Again, you've got to know it from the inside. So let's start with the elegant simplicity of line art. In the early 20th century, it was done by ruling pen. In my era, we had the rapidograph. The colored bands you see on the pens refer to the different line weights, the different sizes of the pen points. And using those pens with French curves, ellipse guides, you'd wind up doing components of cutaway art looking like this. It was interesting because you were defining three-dimensional structure in 2 dimensions, but you had the shape of the airplane. And this is a good example of the different line weights. You can see on this bulkhead, the rendering showing the structure defined by the thick or thin lines of the rapidograph pen. Well, this is a photo of a Douglas 826 Invader. This is called a profile view. This then would be a profile drawing. And if you took away the skin and showed the inside of the fuselage, you'd have an inboard profile. The Boeing 707 prototype seen here first flew in 1954, and the Boeing company needed artwork to sell this airplane to prospective airline customers. So they created brochures that you see here and used tech art, including cutaways. This is an orthographic view of the 707 showing the fuel system. Here's a similar view showing part of the control system, specifically the rudder linkage. And here's a close-up. Boy, you talk about world-class tech art. All the major companies had fantastic art departments with really talented artists doing work like this. And they're not hand lettering anymore. Now that's typeset. Here we've got the General Dynamics FB-111. And this is another drawing in that series that you saw earlier, showing more of the structural components. But again, a very simple, elegant way of getting the point across, showing how the airplane is built. So what happens when you have a 162-foot long B-36? How do you show the inside of that? Well, here's a beautiful cutaway from Consolidated. And here's a detail showing the cockpit area. But what's interesting about this is that you can use the cutaway to show and highlight certain parts of the airplane. For instance, here you've got all the armament, the bomb bays, the tail gun, and then you reverse it and show the almost minuscule areas devoted to the crew compared to the relative size of the airplane. It's a massive machine. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got this sailplane, a Blahnik L-13, and this is a cutaway I did for a sales brochure for the company. This is called an exploded view. Here we have a Northrop F-89H Scorpion in exploded view. I know that's an odd term to use with an airplane, but it refers to the components or the structure being separated the way you see there to show each piece of it clearly. And there's the airplane, the F-89 Scorpion. Now, this machine is the Grumman Gulfstream, twin turboprop, one of the first executive aircraft back in the late 1950s. And this cutaway is something different. This is called a negative cutaway or reverse drawing. What that means is that you are using white lines on a dark background, much like a blueprint. Very effective way of showing the structure. And again, Grumman's art department, wow, some great stuff. Here's the Douglas C-54 Skymaster, a cargo transport. But the first 24 airplanes built were actually long-range passenger liners. They could hold 26 passengers in the rear compartment that you see there. And here's a detail showing the large internal fuel tanks in the midsection and the cockpit. This is also an R.G. Smith drawing, hand-lettered. There's the passenger compartment in the aft fuselage. And this was meant to transport people across the oceans, long distances, nonstop, which had not been possible before this. Now, no mention of cutaway art would be complete without Great Britain's Flight International magazine, some of the greatest cutaway art ever created. Being respectful of the copyright, I'm going to show you the artwork by itself. This is the English Electric F-2 Lightning by Arthur Bowbeer. And then we have Grumman F-11 Tiger by another great artist, Mike Bedrock. Well, let's talk about the addition of tone. We take our basic line drawing and we add some tonality showing both the color scheme, camouflage on the outside, and the internal structure. This is a Lockheed A-29 Hudson, light patrol aircraft, photo recon, electronic intercept. And it's an interesting way of showing the working part of the airplane with just the fuselage cut away. Similar here, the Sikorsky S-42 Clipper for Pan Am, a beautiful airbrush rendering showing the airplane in flight. This close-up shows the cockpit and the navigator's station. The Ryan NYP, that stands for New York to Paris. It was Charles Lindbergh's airplane on the iconic 1927 nonstop flight. And the Spirit of St. Louis was really a flying fuel tank. If you look at the amount of space taken up, the capacity was 450 gallons. And to put that in perspective, the Cherokee I used to fly was 50 gallons capacity. The empty weight of the NYP was just over 2,000 pounds. The max takeoff gross weight was just over 5,000 pounds. So 3,000 pounds, or 3/5 of the airplane's weight at takeoff, was fuel. But again, the cutaway is a wonderful way to show that piece of information. Now here we have a Curtiss Condor, an American Airlines livery, and it's an unconventional way to take the top wing and literally separate it, but we're showing the inside of the fuselage to best effect. And notice the scale of the figures, how large the pilots are compared to the steward making up the bed in the compartment behind the cockpit, and then go to the aft cabin, and you see a kind of an exaggeration in the reduced size of the passengers, but it's all to good effect. Same thing applies here, the inside of the United DC-7. Passengers are drawn smaller than actual scale, but it's to convey the spacious luxury of this giant queen of the skies at that time. And this is an interesting technique. We're just literally taking the external skin off the structure of the airplane. This is Lockheed's art department in Burbank, California, the first two-seat F-104 Starfighter. And you see the addition of the rear cockpit, the deletion of the 20 millimeter cannon. And it's just showing the structure of the airplane minus the skin. This is done in airbrush, by the way. Now, if we take everything we just discussed up to this point and we add color, here's what happens. This is a Boeing 747-400 I did for a client that was the company that made the airliner seats that you see here. And so this was a basic line drawing with flat color added to define the structure and highlight the seats as you see. The other end of the scale would be a full rendering with the airplane cut away. And this is the brilliant British artist Roy Cross showing the Bell X-1 rocket plane in flight over a complete rendered background with the airplane skin cutaway showing the propellant tanks, part of the guidance system, the data recording system, and of course, the pilot in the cockpit and the rocket engine in the back. Well, we go from a British artist to a British sports car. This is one of the favorite cars I ever owned. It was a 1972 Triumph TR6, and it's parked at Orange County Airport at the Tallman's Museum. Shameless plug, but the airplane behind it is a Fairchild 24 with an inline Ranger engine. And this cutaway shows the same airplane, but with a Warner Scarab radial engine. This is part of a series for Flying Magazine. The tech art, again, by R.G. Smith, and the coloration by R.J. Poole. This was a long-running series of cutaways in flying. Look at the detail. Pilots are dressed to the nines, as they said back in that era, but you see the engine, the aircraft structure, and it's a very vivid, beautiful rendering of a very classic aircraft. The idea of looking up at a cutaway is interesting because here you're seeing the engines, the radar system, and most of the business part of the Douglas F-3D Skyknight is shown to best effect in the cutaway. Again, this is R.G. Smith. You see the giant radar dish, the pilots. I always get a kick out of the pilots wearing baseball caps and earphones, but early in the scheme of things, but a beautiful way of showing all the internal structure and everything is there. Here we have a consolidated B-24 Liberator. And this is just a stunning piece of artwork, also part of the Flying Magazine series. Let's look at a detail. The art is by Reynold Brown. What's interesting is that the color is what I call very localized, meaning that the airplane is rendered in the colors that you would see. In other words, the internal structure is zinc chromate. It's got silver external skins. Props are rendered correctly. Very effective. Now here's a Super 80 DC-9 cutaway that I did for McDonnell Douglas, and I had to divide the cabin into sections to ease the look of the 165 seats in a single aisle cabin. It's a long airplane. And so I chose to alternate every 5 rows blue and gold upholstery. And as much as I'd love to claim that idea as my own, I really can't because I acquired that idea from this brochure of another Douglas airplane, the Eastern DC-7 Golden Falcon, which had a similar idea for breaking up the interior. So sometimes history does play a part in current projects. The F-20 Tiger Shark. Now this is an interesting cutaway because it's done in airbrush and the color is coded to the components of the aircraft. In other words, green internal structure, armament, silver power plant, red fuel system, and it's a combination of beautiful rendering of the external and internal parts of the airplane. Really works as a nice composition. And again, this is Northrop's art department in Hawthorne, California. And then at the end of the 20th century, you had the advent of computer artwork or digitally generated art. As you see here, the Lockheed, what is now the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, VTOL version. And this is digitally generated art, very sharp, very crisp, beautiful color. and a very vivid way of showing the interior of a current digital age aircraft. Well, we've looked at line art, we've looked at black and white tone, and we looked at full color. And that gives you a good idea of cutaways, which I call an inside look at some great, great aircraft. And there you have it. A look at the golden age of tech illustration and the whole art of cutaway artwork. I'd like to dedicate this episode to the legendary cutaway artists from that era. And thank you for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. Really appreciate your watching. If you haven't subscribed, we'd love having you on board. Please do hit the like button before you leave. That does help us with YouTube. And as always, until next time, take care.